Eleanor Whitmore had spent 40 years building Whitmore Industries into one of the most powerful manufacturing companies in the Midwest. At 62, she was still sharp as a tack. Her steel gray hair always perfectly coiffed, her tailored suits a silent declaration of power. The media called her the Iron Magnolia, soft-spoken, but impossible to bend. But there was one thing Eleanor could not control: her son's choice in women. Matthew, her only child, had married Sarah 2 years ago. Sarah was kind and pretty enough, but Eleanor never fully believed in her. She was a nurse from a small Midwestern town, raised in a family that scraped by on odd jobs and thrift store bargains. Eleanor's mind whispered the same suspicion over and over. She married Matthew for his money. When Matthew took an overseas project that would keep him in Singapore for 6 months, Eleanor saw her chance. She devised a plan so outrageous she almost laughed. She would pretend to be bankrupt, lose everything, and move in with Sarah. If Sarah was truly genuine, she would treat Eleanor with respect even without the luxury and status. If not, Eleanor would know soon enough. It took her only 2 weeks to set the stage. Through carefully staged press leaks, Whitmore Industries appeared to collapse overnight, supposedly swallowed by a massive financial scandal. Paparazzi snapped photos of Eleanor leaving her mansion with only a few suitcases. Even her staff believed she was ruined, because she didn't tell them otherwise. When the final piece was in place, Eleanor picked up her phone and called Sarah. "Sarah," she began, injecting just the right amount of tremble into her voice. I'm afraid I have nowhere else to go." There was a pause on the other end. Eleanor pictured Sarah calculating, perhaps weighing the inconvenience against her own comfort. "Of course, Eleanor," Sarah finally said. Her voice was gentle, but a little unsure. "You can stay with me for as long as you need." Eleanor's lips twitched, part satisfaction, part doubt. This was just the first step. The next afternoon, a battered yellow cab dropped Eleanor off in front of Sarah's modest 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet suburb on the edge of Columbus, Ohio. The trees lining the street were bare, their twisted branches rattling in the chilly November wind. Sarah came down the steps, wearing jeans, a thick sweater, and an old parka. She smiled warmly. "You must be freezing. Come inside." Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon and laundry detergent. It was neat but modest, mismatched furniture, second-hand shelves, and a tiny kitchen with a round table pushed against the wall. Eleanor set her suitcase down, taking in the absence of marble floors or crystal chandeliers. Sarah showed her to the spare bedroom, small, with a single bed and a quilt that looked handmade. "I hope it's comfortable enough," she said. "It will do," Eleanor replied, her tone clipped. She didn't miss the flicker of something, maybe hurt, in Sarah's eyes. That evening, Sarah served a simple dinner, chicken soup with fresh bread. Eleanor sipped it slowly, noticing how Sarah kept asking if she needed more blankets, more tea, more anything. Eleanor couldn't decide if this was genuine kindness, or just the opening move in Sarah's own game. The test had officially begun. The first week in Sarah's apartment was polite, but sharp around the edges. Eleanor carried herself as if she were still in her penthouse suite, chin high, back straight, even while sitting at the small, slightly wobbly kitchen table. Sarah, in turn, moved around her like someone carefully navigating an invisible minefield. On Monday morning, Sarah offered Eleanor coffee in a plain white mug. Eleanor took one sip and paused. "It's different," she remarked. Sarah smiled politely. "It's just the store brand. It's what I usually drink." "Ah," Eleanor replied, as if that explained everything and nothing. Sarah noticed the older woman glancing disapprovingly at the small living room, where the sofa had a faint tear along one seam. That evening, she found Eleanor standing in front of her bookshelf, running her fingers over the spines. "Mostly paperbacks," Eleanor murmured, as though surprised people still read them. The nights were quieter than Eleanor was used to. No distant hum of traffic outside penthouse windows, no clicking heels of staff in the hallways. Instead, there was the faint creak of the apartment settling and the occasional muffled TV from the neighbor's unit. Eleanor lay on the narrow bed, the mattress too soft in some places and too firm in others. She thought of the queen-sized memory foam mattress she had left behind and told herself, this is the point. This is the test. On Wednesday, Sarah suggested they eat dinner together after her shift. She arrived home from the hospital tired, hair slightly messy, carrying a grocery bag. I made lasagna, Sarah said, sliding the dish out of the oven. Eleanor examined the bubbling cheese. You cook often? Not always, Sarah admitted. But I thought you might enjoy something homemade. Eleanor nodded, but inside she wondered if it was genuine hospitality or strategic charm. One night, Eleanor awoke to faint humming. She stepped into the hallway and found Sarah at the kitchen table, mending a cardigan Eleanor had left draped over a chair. You could have just left it, Eleanor said. Sarah looked up, startled, then smiled. It's just a loose button. I like fixing things. Eleanor stood there for a moment, unsure how to respond. She returned to bed with a question she didn't like asking herself. Would someone only after money bother to sew a button at midnight? By Friday, they had developed an unspoken rhythm. Sarah rose early for work, leaving Eleanor with the quiet apartment. Eleanor would make herself tea and sometimes sweep the kitchen floor, though she would never admit it was to repay the hospitality. That afternoon, Sarah came home with a loaf of fresh bread from a local bakery. I thought you might miss something good to go with your tea, she said. Eleanor broke off a piece, tasting the crisp crust. Better than I expected, she admitted, though her tone was still neutral. But under the surface, both women were watching each other closely. Sarah wondered if Eleanor truly was adjusting or just counting the days until she could leave. Eleanor wondered if Sarah's patience was a mask that might slip any moment. The week ended with a strange, almost reluctant truce, not warmth, not yet, but something that could one day resemble it. It was Saturday morning when Sarah knocked lightly on Eleanor's bedroom door. Do you have plans today? Sarah asked. Eleanor, sitting at the small desk with a cup of tea, looked up. Not particularly. Why? I'm heading to the community kitchen. We serve lunch there every weekend. Thought you might want to join me. Eleanor blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. A soup kitchen? Yes, Sarah replied simply, pulling on her coat. We cook, serve, and clean up. It's nice. Eleanor hesitated. The idea of standing behind a counter ladling soup into plastic bowls for strangers seemed foreign. But curiosity, and perhaps the faintest desire not to appear completely uncooperative, made her nod. Fine. But only for a little while. The community kitchen sat in a brick building with faded green doors. Inside, the air smelled of simmering onions and fresh bread. Volunteers bustled about, wearing aprons, stacking loaves, and stirring enormous pots. Sarah tied an apron around Eleanor's waist. Here, you'll be on bread duty. Just hand out slices as people come through. Eleanor glanced down at the plain white bread knife in her hand, then at the long line forming outside. Many of the people waiting wore worn coats, their shoes scuffed, their faces tired. The first man approached, offering a small smile. Morning. Eleanor handed him a slice of bread, her fingers brushing his rough, calloused skin. Morning, she replied stiffly. The next was a young mother with 2 children clinging to her legs. Eleanor hesitated before giving her 3 slices. Thank you, the woman whispered. After 30 minutes, Eleanor began to notice the small rituals. How Sarah knelt to speak to the children at eye level, how she always added an extra spoonful of soup to the bowls of the elderly, how she remembered people's names. During a break, Eleanor leaned against the counter. You do this every week? Sarah nodded, sipping from a paper cup of tea. My mom used to bring me here when I was a kid. She said helping others is the rent we pay for living in this world. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. And you get nothing for it? Sarah smiled faintly. Not everything worth doing pays in money. When the last guest left, the volunteers began wiping down tables and stacking chairs. Eleanor picked up a rag almost without thinking and began cleaning the counter. Sarah noticed but said nothing. As they walked back to the car, Eleanor found herself quieter than usual. The cold air bit at her cheeks, but inside she felt a strange warmth she couldn't quite place. I suppose, Eleanor said slowly, it wasn't the worst way to spend a morning. Sarah laughed. That's the nicest thing you've said all week. That night, Eleanor sat alone in her borrowed bedroom. She thought about the young mother with the 2 children, about the way Sarah's face softened when she spoke to each person. For the first time, she wondered if she had misjudged her daughter-in-law. But then pride whispered in her ear, it's just part of the act. Anyone can be kind for a few hours. Eleanor pushed the thought away, but it lingered in the quiet. It was a rainy Tuesday evening, the kind of night where the streets glistened under the yellow glow of street lamps and the air smelled faintly of wet asphalt. Sarah had worked a 12-hour shift at the hospital, her scrubs damp from the drizzle. Eleanor sat on the couch, sipping tea, flipping through the channels without really watching. When Sarah came in, she hung her coat by the door, dropped her bag, and offered a small smile. Long day, she murmured. Eleanor glanced at her but said nothing. They ate in relative silence, leftover vegetable stew and slices of bread. Sarah seemed distracted, her mind elsewhere. Eleanor noticed but didn't ask. After dinner, Sarah cleared the table, and Eleanor retreated to the spare room. It was close to midnight when Eleanor got up for a glass of water. As she passed the kitchen, she heard Sarah's voice, low, tired, and trembling. She stopped just beyond the doorway. I'm exhausted, Jess, Sarah whispered into the phone. Her friend's voice was muffled on the other end, but Sarah continued. It's like, I can't win. She criticizes the coffee, the food, the bed, everything. I'm trying so hard to make her feel welcome, but it's like living with a queen who lost her throne. Eleanor's hand tightened around the doorframe. She's Matthew's mother, so I'm doing my best. But some nights, Sarah's voice wavered, some nights I just want to shut the door and cry. There was a pause, and then Sarah added quietly, still, I remind myself, she's family. And if Matthew were here, he'd want me to take care of her. So I will, no matter how hard it gets. Eleanor stepped back, her chest tight. She wasn't used to hearing people speak about her that way, raw, unfiltered, and unafraid of hurting her pride because they didn't know she was listening. She slipped into the hallway, glass of water forgotten, and returned to her room. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she stared at the handmade quilt covering her legs. For the first time, she considered that maybe Sarah's patience wasn't an act. Maybe it was loyalty, not to Eleanor, but to Matthew, and perhaps in some quiet way to the idea of family. The next morning, Eleanor found Sarah already in the kitchen, hair still damp from a shower, flipping pancakes. The smell of butter and maple syrup filled the air. Morning, Sarah said, smiling as though nothing had happened. I thought I'd make something nice before work. Eleanor hesitated before replying. You didn't have to. I know, Sarah said, sliding a pancake onto a plate. But I wanted to. Eleanor sat down, watching her work. She wanted to apologize, to acknowledge what she'd overheard, but the words stayed stuck in her throat. Pride was a stubborn thing, and she wasn't ready to let hers go. Not yet. But all day, Sarah's voice from the night before echoed in her mind. She's Matthew's mother, so I will take care of her. It was the first time in years Eleanor felt the faint, uncomfortable prick of guilt. And guilt, she knew, was a sign her carefully built armor was beginning to crack. It started with the kitchen. On Thursday morning, Eleanor decided she was tired of the way Sarah arranged the pantry. The canned goods were on the bottom shelf, the coffee tucked in a corner, and the tea stacked behind cereal boxes. It was, to Eleanor's mind, chaos. While Sarah was at work, she reorganized everything, neatly lined up labels, dry goods in perfectly aligned rows, and the tea moved to what she considered its proper place. When Sarah returned that evening, she stopped in front of the pantry with her bag still over her shoulder. "Did you move everything?" "Yes," Eleanor replied without looking up from her crossword puzzle. "It was inefficient." Sarah closed the pantry slowly. "I knew where everything was." "Now you know where everything should be," Eleanor said, the faintest edge in her tone. It didn't stop there. That night after dinner, Eleanor deliberately left her dishes in the sink without rinsing them. The next morning, she made a comment about the thinness of the blankets in the guest room. And when Sarah tried to talk about her day at the hospital, Eleanor interrupted with, "Matthew always said you talk too much when you're tired." Sarah froze, the words hitting like a slap. "Excuse me." Eleanor took a slow sip of tea. "I'm just saying, you might consider being a little more restrained." That was the moment something inside Sarah snapped. She set her coffee cup down with a sharp clink and stood in the middle of the kitchen, hands planted on the counter. Her voice was calm at first, but the calm was razor thin. "Eleanor, I've tried to be patient. I've tried to make you feel welcome in my home, even when you make it very clear you don't think it's good enough for you. I've bitten my tongue every time you criticize my cooking, my furniture, my life." Eleanor opened her mouth, but Sarah's voice rose, cutting her off. "You think I married Matthew for his money? Fine, think it. But you should know something. I married your son because I love him. I would live in a tent with him if I had to. Do you understand that? A tent. In the rain. With nothing but a blanket." The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavy. Eleanor sat back, stunned not by the words, but by the fierce sincerity in Sarah's voice. Sarah's eyes were bright, her cheeks flushed. "You've treated me like I'm some kind of intruder in your family. And maybe I can't prove to you that I'm not after your money. But I can prove this. I've been here. Every day. Taking care of you. Even when it hurts." Silence stretched between them. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. Eleanor looked away first, staring down at the crossword she hadn't finished. Without another word, Sarah turned, walked to her room, and shut the door, not loudly, but with a finality that made Eleanor's chest feel tight. For the first time since she'd started her test, Eleanor wondered if she had gone too far, and if the damage she'd done might not be so easy to undo. The next morning, the apartment felt unusually quiet. Sarah had already left for work, her bedroom door firmly shut. Eleanor sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched tea. The weight in her chest was heavier than she expected. She glanced at her phone. It was time. By late afternoon, Sarah returned from her shift, tired and still a little raw from the night before. She turned the corner onto her street and froze. Parked directly in front of her apartment building was a sleek, black limousine, its glossy surface reflecting the pale winter sunlight. A man in a tailored suit stood by the rear door, hands clasped behind his back. Sarah's steps slowed. She spotted Eleanor standing beside the limo, wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit and polished black heels. Her hair was back to its immaculate chignon, her makeup subtle but flawless. The woman before her was not the weary, broke mother-in-law who had arrived with a battered suitcase. This was the Iron Magnolia. "What is this?" Sarah asked, her voice guarded. Eleanor walked forward, her heels clicking softly on the pavement. "I'm not bankrupt, Sarah," she said quietly. "I never was." Sarah blinked. "Excuse me. This," Eleanor gestured vaguely toward the apartment building, "was a test. I wanted to see who you really were, without the money, without the influence. I needed to know if you loved Matthew for him, or for what he could give you." The words hit like a slap, but Sarah didn't flinch. "So, you watched me struggle. You let me feel guilty for not being able to give you more. All just to satisfy your suspicion." Eleanor's voice softened. "I watched you care for me. I watched you give me your bed, cook for me after 12-hour shifts, fix my sweater in the middle of the night. And last night, you told me you'd live in a tent with Matthew if you had to." She took a breath. "Sarah, you passed." Sarah's hands curled into fists at her sides. "I wasn't taking a test, Eleanor. I was living my life, trying to make you feel at home, and you turned it into an experiment." "I know," Eleanor admitted. "And I'm sorry. Truly." For the first time since Sarah had met her, Eleanor looked small, vulnerable. "I've spent decades surrounded by people who wanted something from me," Eleanor said. "And I was so sure you were one of them. But I was wrong." The driver stepped forward and opened the limo door. Inside, Sarah could see a leather briefcase and a large manila envelope resting on the seat. Eleanor gestured toward it. "I bought you and Matthew a house here in town. Not as a bribe, not as payment, but as a thank you. A place that's yours." Sarah didn't move toward the car. She just looked at Eleanor for a long moment, searching her face. Finally, she sighed. "You really don't make it easy to like you." A faint smile tugged at Eleanor's lips. "No. But I hope I can make it easier, starting now." The limo engine purred softly, the air between them still heavy with unspoken feelings. For the first time, Eleanor realized the test had revealed something else, not just Sarah's character, but the cracks in her own. Thanksgiving came 2 weeks later, crisp and golden. The little two-story house Eleanor had bought for Sarah and Matthew sat at the end of a quiet street, its white siding glowing in the late afternoon sun. A wreath of autumn leaves hung on the front door, and the smell of roasting turkey drifted into the neighborhood. Sarah stood in the kitchen, wearing a flour-dusted apron, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. The counters were crowded with bowls, mashed potatoes, green beans, cranberry sauce, and a pumpkin pie cooling by the window. Eleanor arrived right on time, carrying a bouquet of deep orange roses. She wore a soft cream sweater instead of a suit, her heels replaced by sensible flats. There was a faint awkwardness in the way she stepped inside, like a woman still learning how to be welcome without owning the room. "Come in, Eleanor," Sarah said with a polite smile. "Thank you for having me," Eleanor replied, handing over the flowers. Her voice held none of the cool, testing edge it once carried. Matthew, home from Singapore at last, moved around the kitchen with ease, basting the turkey, stealing a bite of pie filling when Sarah wasn't looking, hugging his mother when she passed by. At one point, Eleanor found herself at the counter beside Sarah, chopping celery for the stuffing. For a few minutes, they worked in silence, the clink of the knife against the cutting board the only sound. "You know," Eleanor said finally, "you make a better cup of coffee than any imported brand I've ever had." Sarah looked at her, surprised. "Is that a compliment?" Eleanor's lips curved into a small smile. "It is. And I don't hand those out lightly." Dinner was warm and lively. Matthew told stories from his trip, Sarah teased him for forgetting to call during a storm, and Eleanor laughed, genuinely laughed, at a joke about her overpacking for vacations. The tension of the past weeks hadn't vanished completely, but it had shifted. After dessert, Eleanor stepped onto the porch with a mug of tea. Sarah joined her, wrapping a cardigan around her shoulders. The air was cool, the sky streaked with fading pink. "I wasn't sure you'd invite me today," Eleanor admitted. Sarah's gaze stayed on the horizon. "I almost didn't, but Matthew loves you. And despite everything, I think I understand you a little better now." Eleanor swallowed, the words settling heavily but not painfully. "I'm still sorry, Sarah, for doubting you, for testing you like that." Sarah nodded once. "I'm still not sure I've forgiven you, but I'm willing to try." They stood there for a while, side by side, listening to the distant laughter of Matthew cleaning up inside. It wasn't the perfect ending Eleanor had once imagined. No grand declarations, no instant best friendship, but it was real. When Eleanor finally left that night, she looked back at the little house, its windows glowing warmly against the dark. She realized she didn't just approve of her son's wife, she respected her. And in Eleanor Whitmore's world, that was the rarest gift she could give.